The Sunday lunch rush at Merle's Diner was winding down the way it always did in Clanton, Alabama, slow and easy, like a river finding its depth after the morning current. The smell of chicken fried steak and fresh cornbread hung in the warm air. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. The old ceiling fans turned lazy circles overhead, pushing the heat around without doing much about it. Katie Hale moved between the tables with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done a thing long enough that it has become second nature. She was 19 years old with chestnut hair she kept tucked behind one ear and eyes that noticed everything. Who needed a refill before they asked which table was getting restless, which regular was having a harder week than usual, and needed an extra minute of conversation more than they needed their food. The leather bracelet on her left wrist was worn smooth from years of handling a simple braid of dark cowhide with a small iron clasp, the kind a man makes by hand rather than buys from a store. Her father had made it for her 18th birthday, sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, with his tools spread out and his reading glasses on, and his complete refusal to acknowledge that the project mattered to him. She had never taken it off. She refilled coffee for old Mr. Calloway at the counter, who thanked her the same way he thanked her every Sunday by tapping the rim of his cup twice and nodding like she'd done him a great personal favor. She checked on the Whitfield family near the window, crouching down to make a face at their toddler, until the little boy laughed so hard he nearly knocked his juice off the table. She carried 4 plates from the kitchen pass-through without using a tray, balancing them along her forearms, the way Merle had taught her when she first started at 16, back when she was still figuring out what kind of person she was going to be. Merle himself stood in the kitchen doorway, thick arms folded across his chest, watching her work. He was 60 years old and had owned this diner for 30 of them. He'd seen plenty of young people come and go through that front door, kids who stayed a summer and moved on, kids who couldn't handle the pace, kids who were too interested in their phones to be interested in their customers. Katie Hale had stayed. Something about her made the regulars feel like they were eating in someone's kitchen instead of a restaurant. He couldn't explain it exactly. It was just the way she was. Sheriff Wren Adler came in around noon, removing her hat as she stepped through the door the way she always did. A small gesture of respect for the interior of a place she'd been eating in for 20 years. She was 52 with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had been shaped by 2 decades of hard decisions. She took her usual booth near the back, the one with the clear sight line to both the door and the counter, and ordered without looking at the menu, because she hadn't needed to look at a menu here in 15 years. Katie brought her coffee before she even asked for it. "Your father working today?" Adler asked, wrapping both hands around the mug. "Out at Grayson's farm," Katie said. "Transmission job. Could take all afternoon." Adler nodded, not pressing further. Everyone in Clanton knew Jack Hale's history. Most gave him a wide berth out of habit or instinct, or the particular caution that attaches itself to men with certain kinds of pasts, even when those men have spent a decade doing nothing more alarming than fixing engines in a small-town garage. But Katie had carved out her own identity in this town, entirely separate from her father's reputation, built on nothing more than showing up every day with that steady, genuine warmth that people couldn't help responding to. "Chicken and dumplings?" Katie asked, pen hovering. "You know me too well," Adler said, near the window. Mrs. Vera Stanton caught Katie's eye and waved her over. Vera was 72, a retired school teacher who came in every Sunday dressed in her best blouse, her white hair pinned carefully, her hands a little more unsteady with the teacup each passing year. She lived in the apartment above the alley behind the diner, had lived there for 15 years, and had been eating at this counter since before Katie was born. "You look tired, sweetheart," Vera said as Katie refilled her tea. "Long week," Katie said, "but good." Vera studied her for a moment with the quiet perceptiveness of someone who had spent 30 years reading the faces of children. "Everything all right at home?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Stanton," Katie said, and her smile didn't waver. But something moved briefly behind her eyes, a flicker of something complicated, something that lived deeper than the surface she showed the world before it was gone. The lunch crowd thinned out by 2 o'clock. Katie wiped down the last of the tables and hung up her apron behind the counter. Merle came out of the kitchen drying his hands on a dish towel. Go on home, he said. We're dead as a Sunday afternoon deserves to be. Katie laughed and grabbed her denim jacket and her worn canvas bag from beneath the counter. She paused at the door, tilting her face toward the warmth outside. The spring afternoon had that particular Alabama quality, heavy and golden, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and red clay, and something blooming in the vacant lot across the street. She started down the sidewalk, then turned toward the alley. It was the shortcut she'd taken 100 times, a narrow passage between Merle's Diner and Dawson's Hardware, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. The tall brick walls blocked most of the afternoon light, leaving the alley in a cool shadow that smelled of damp concrete and old wood. Cardboard boxes were stacked near the dumpster. A cat she recognized, a gray Tom the cooks called Sergeant, watched her from the top of a crate with complete indifference. She was 10 steps in when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn right away. Don't let them know you heard. Don't let them see the change. Her father's voice from years ago, patient and precise. She kept her pace even. Katie Hale. The voice stopped her cold. Not a question. A statement flat and certain, the way someone says a name when they already know the answer and want you to understand that they do. She turned slowly. The man stood near the alley entrance, partially backlit by the afternoon sun. He was broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket despite the warmth, a baseball cap pulled low over a face she didn't recognize. He wasn't a local. She knew every face in Clanton, and his was not among them. His eyes were steady and cold, with the particular emptiness of someone who had made their decision before they arrived. Do I know you? Katie kept her voice level. I took a step forward. No, but I know all about you. He let that sit for a moment. About your little project. About the questions you've been asking. Her breath caught. The notebook. Her mother. But how could he possibly know? I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Don't play dumb. His voice dropped to something worse than a whisper, a quiet, flat certainty. The letters, the phone calls, the coffee meetings. It stops now. Katie's mind raced. She had been so careful. She had told no one about her search for Claire, not her friends, not Merle, not her father. Especially not her father. She had kept every note in a book she hid inside a hollowed-out copy of a novel on her bedroom shelf. She had used a separate email address on her phone. She had chosen meeting places 30 miles from Clanton. She had been careful in the way that only someone raised around secrets understands how to be careful. She's my mother, Katie said, and was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. I have every right to know her. The man's expression didn't change. It never changed. That was the most frightening thing about him. Some things are better left alone. Some people are where they are for a reason. You've been pulling at threads that don't belong to you. They belong to me more than they belong to you, she said. He moved closer. His boots scraped against the wet concrete. Consider this your only warning. Stop looking for Claire. Stop asking about the past. If you know what's good for you, what's good for your father, you'll drop this. Today. At the mention of her father, something shifted inside her. Fear compressed itself into something harder. Don't you dare bring my dad into this. He has nothing to do with it. He has everything to do with it. For the first time, something moved in the man's face. Not emotion exactly. More like the surface of still water registering a weight drop from height. Tell your father that Raymond Doyle never forgot Harlan County. She didn't know that name. She didn't understand what it meant. But the way he said it, like a sentence already written and waiting to be delivered, told her it would mean something to Jack. She didn't have time to respond. The first blow came without warning, a hard strike to her midsection that drove all the air from her lungs and bent her double. She tried to straighten, tried to pull in breath, but before she could, the second blow caught her across the face with a force that sent white light spiking through her vision and put her on the ground. The concrete was cold and rough against her palms. She tried to push herself up. Her arms shook. She tasted blood, thick and metallic against her tongue. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard him still talking. his voice calm, almost conversational, as though this were simply the practical portion of a necessary transaction. His boot connected with her ribs. Once. The pain was immediate and enormous, a bright white explosion that erased everything else for a full second. She heard something crack inside her chest, and for a moment the world reduced itself to that single point of agony. She tried to crawl. Her fingers scraped at the concrete. He let her try. Then he crouched down and took a hold of her wrist, the left one, the one with the bracelet, and held it up between them. She felt the leather pull tight against her skin. She felt the small iron clasp give way with a sharp snap. He dropped the bracelet on the ground beside her face, where she could see it lying in the thin trickle of water that ran along the base of the wall. "Tell your father," he said quietly, "that Raymond Doyle never forgot Harlan County. Tell him this is just a reminder of what's owed." She heard his footsteps move away. She heard the sound of the street traffic, a distant radio birds, as the alley entrance brightened for a moment and then returned to its usual shadow. Then silence. She lay still. Breathing was the only project available to her, and even that was complicated. Each shallow inhale lit up the left side of her chest with a sharp insistence that she couldn't ignore. She kept her eyes open, focused on the bracelet lying in the water 6 inches from her face. The dark braid of leather. The small iron clasp her father had pressed closed with his thumb on the morning he gave it to her. She did not pass out. Later, she wouldn't be entirely sure why. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe fear of what would happen if she stopped holding on. Either way, she stayed conscious in the dim and quiet of the alley, while the afternoon sun moved slowly above the buildings, and the gray cat watched her from its crate with the same magnificent indifference it gave to everything. Vera Stanton found her 7 minutes later. Vera had come down her back stairs to water the potted ferns she kept on the small landing above the alley, a Sunday ritual she'd maintained for 15 years, regardless of weather. She was 3 steps down when she saw the shape on the ground below and stopped. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, her watering can held at her side, her eyes adjusting to the shadow. Then she recognized the denim jacket, the chestnut hair. "Oh Lord," she said. Then she moved faster than a 72-year-old woman with arthritic knees had any business moving down the remaining stairs and across the alley floor. She dropped to her knees beside Katie and placed one trembling hand on the girl's back. There was movement, shallow but steady. Vera fumbled for her phone with her free hand, dropped it, picked it up, dropped it again, got it on the third try. "This is Vera Stanton," she said when the dispatcher answered. "I'm in the alley behind Merle's Diner on Caldwell Street. There's a young woman on the ground. She's been beaten badly. She's breathing, but she's not moving. Her name is Katie Hale. Please, I need you to hurry." She spotted the bracelet in the puddle beside Katie's face. She recognized it, had seen it on the girl's wrist every Sunday for the past year. She reached down carefully and picked it up and put it in the pocket of her cardigan because she understood, without knowing exactly why, that it needed to be kept safe. She brushed the hair from Katie's face with the backs of her fingers. "Help is coming, sweetheart," she said softly. "You stay with me now. Help is on its way." The sirens came within 4 minutes. The alley filled with lights and voices and the organized urgency of people trained to deal with the worst moments of other people's lives. Paramedics worked quickly and without wasted motion, and within 10 minutes they were moving Katie toward the waiting ambulance on a stretcher. Before they loaded her in, one of them turned to Vera. "Did you see what happened, ma'am?" "I saw the man who did it leaving," Vera said. Her voice was still shaking, but it was steady enough to be clear. "And I heard what he said before he left." She paused. "Someone needs to call her father, Jack Hale. He needs to know." The paramedic nodded. "We'll handle it from the hospital." Vera watched the ambulance doors close. Then she stood in the alley alone for a moment, her hand pressed against the pocket of her cardigan where the bracelet was, and she made a decision. She had Jack Hale's number from the emergency contact form Katie had filled out when she started volunteering at the senior center 2 years ago. Vera had been on the committee that organized it. She had kept the form in her address book because that was the kind of woman she was. careful, thorough, believing that information should be where you can find it when you need it. She called him herself from the alley before the ambulance had even reached the end of the block. Jack Hale was lying under the rear end of a 1998 Dodge Ram at Grayson's farm when his phone buzzed against the concrete beside his tools. He ignored the first buzz. He ignored the second. On the third, something about the persistence of it made him roll out from under the truck and look at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Then some instinct sharpened by years of living in proximity to danger made him pick it up. Mr. Hale. The voice was elderly, female controlled, but clearly frightened. My name is Vera Stanton. I live above the alley behind Merle's Diner. I just found your daughter. She's been hurt badly. They're taking her to Clanton General right now. I thought you should hear it from a person, not a machine. Jack was on his feet before the sentence was finished. How bad, he said. His voice came out level. It always came out level. That was the thing about Jack Hale. The worse the situation, the more still he became on the outside while everything inside moved faster. Bad enough, Vera said. But she was conscious when I found her. She's strong, Mr. Hale. I ended the call and told Grayson's son to lock up the bay. He pulled on his jacket and walked to his bike. His hands were steady as he pressed the ignition. They were always steady. That was the one thing he'd always been able to count on, that no matter what was happening, his hands stayed steady. Except that right now, as the engine came up beneath him, they were not entirely steady. He rode through two red lights on the way to the hospital. He didn't slow down for either of them. Jack Hale was 45 years old and had lived a life that had required him to make peace with a great many things that other men couldn't make peace with. He had ridden in places and done things and stood in rooms where the decisions being made were the kind that didn't go in any record. And he had carried all of it without outward complaint, because carrying weight without complaint was the only religion he had ever truly practiced. I was 6'2" and 220 pounds of a man who had been shaped by decades of physical work, most of it hard. His forearms were covered in ink, not decorative tattoos, but the kind acquired over years, each one marking something, a chapter, a person, a place he'd been, or a thing he'd survived. His face was weathered in the way of men who spend their lives outdoors, the skin around his eyes carved into permanent squint lines from years of sun, his jaw rough with 2 days of gray-dark stubble. I had been a member of the Devil's Iron Motorcycle Club for 11 years before he walked away. He had a daughter to raise in a town where he could raise her decently, and he had made the calculation that mattered most. The life he'd been living was not compatible with the father he needed to be. So he left it behind and became a mechanic in a small Alabama town and watched his daughter grow into someone who was, by any honest measure, better than anything else he'd ever had a hand in building. He had not expected anything to follow him here. That had been, as he now understood, a failure of imagination. The automatic doors of Clanton General barely had time to part before he was through them. His boots hit the polished floor hard. A man at the reception desk started to say something about check-in, and Jack walked past him without breaking stride. A nurse intercepted him in the hallway with the calm authority that comes from years of dealing with frightened family members who are also large and moving fast. She put herself in his path and said his name clearly. Mr. Hale, I'm going to take you to the doctor right now. Katie is in the trauma unit. She is stable. Can you hear me? She is stable. He stopped, looked at her. Take me to her. Dr. Patricia Reeves met him outside the trauma bay, a compact woman in her early 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the unhurried efficiency of someone who has been delivering hard news for long enough that she knows the value of saying it plainly. Your daughter has a severe concussion, she said. 3 broken ribs on the left side, a fractured wrist, numerous contusions and lacerations. There is some internal bleeding. We're watching it closely, but it appears to be slowing on its own. She's unconscious, but her vitals are stable. The next 24 hours are important, but I want to be honest with you. She is strong and she is young, and right now, everything we're seeing points toward recovery. Jack absorbed every word. Can I see her? Yes, the doctor said. Talk to her. Patients often hear more than we expect. He pushed open the door. The room was dim and quiet, except for the rhythmic percussion of the monitors. Katie lay in the hospital bed, looking nothing at all. Like herself, pale and motionless, her face swollen on the left side, a cut along her cheekbone closed with neat stitches, her right arm in a temporary cast, her head wrapped in white bandaging. Tubes and wires ran from various points on her body to machines that stood around the bed like sentinels. Jack stood in the doorway for a moment. He had stood in a lot of doorways in his life, in a lot of difficult rooms, and had always been able to move forward because moving forward was what he did. But for several seconds, he simply stood in this one and looked at his daughter and felt something inside him that he did not have a word for. A cracking, a giving way, something structural failing under a weight he hadn't anticipated. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed. He reached out and took her hand carefully around the IV line and held it between both of his. "I'm here, Katie," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Daddy's right here." She didn't respond. The monitors beeped their steady count. He sat with her for a long time. The rage was there. He could feel it, a slow burn at the base of everything, waiting for him to give it direction. But beneath the rage was something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. The pure, cold kind. Not for himself, he hadn't been afraid for himself in longer than he could remember. This was different. This was the kind of fear that has no defense because it lives in something outside of you, something you cannot protect by being harder or faster or more willing to absorb punishment. It lived in the small hand he was holding, in the shallow breath rising and falling beneath the white sheet. A nurse came in quietly and checked the monitors. After a moment, she set a clear plastic bag on the bedside table, Katie's personal effects. She said something gentle and left. Jack looked at the bag. He recognized the canvas bag inside the one with the broken zipper on the front pocket she'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. He pulled it toward him and went through it carefully. Her wallet, her keys, her phone with the cracked screen she'd been too practical to replace. A lip balm, a hair tie, a folded receipt from a gas station in Meridian, a town 30 miles away, which gave him pause because Katie had no reason to be in Meridian. And then at the bottom of the bag, wrapped inside a cotton bandana, a small notebook. It was the size of a paperback novel with a soft cover, the color of old moss, the edges worn from frequent handling. A frayed green ribbon marked a page somewhere near the middle. Jack held it in his hands for a moment without opening it. He had the particular feeling that comes before you read something you cannot unread, a last beat of the world as it currently exists. He opened it. The handwriting was Katie's, neat and careful, the same hand that had written him birthday cards every year and left grocery lists on the kitchen counter, and once when she was 12 had written him a letter explaining in 3 precise paragraphs why she thought she was old enough to have a dog. He'd gotten her the dog. The dog had died 4 years ago, and they'd both pretended not to be as broken up about it as they were. The first page read in her careful hand, "Questions for Mom." Below that, a numbered list. 31 questions, some crossed out, some circled, some with notes written in the margins in a smaller, faster script. Why did she leave without saying goodbye? Does she think about us? Did something happen that Dad doesn't know about? What did she mean when she told Mrs. Calloway she had no choice? Where has she been? Does she want to come back? Jack turned the page, and the next, and the next. The notebook documented 6 months of quiet, determined private investigation. Katie had found an old address of Claire's through a forwarding order at the Clanton post office. She had traced it to a P.O. box in Hartselle, then to an email address, then to a phone number. She had written Claire a letter. The actual draft of it was folded into the back of the notebook, careful and measured and devastating in its restraint. "I'm not angry. I just need to understand. I think I deserve that much." There had been a reply, and then meetings. 7 of them documented with dates and locations and careful notes about what was said. Coffee in Decatur, a walk in a state park outside of Coleman, a lunch in Hartselle that had gone 3 hours longer than planned. Jack read every entry. He read slowly and thoroughly, the way he approached anything that mattered. The final entry was dated yesterday. "Meeting Mom tomorrow after my shift." She called tonight and she sounded different, careful, like she was choosing every word. She said she needs to tell me something important. Said it changes everything. Said she's been wanting to tell me for years but was afraid of what it would mean. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I'm ready for it. But I think I've been ready for it my whole life without knowing it. Jack closed the notebook. He set it on the bedside table and sat for a long moment looking at his daughter's face. 14 years. Claire had been gone 14 years since Katie was 4 years old. He had told himself a version of that story, a version in which Claire had made her choices, and those choices had not included them, and the only thing left to do was raise their daughter well, and not let bitterness become the household air Katie breathed. He had managed the second part better than the first, maybe. But Katie had decided at some point in the last 6 months that the story she'd been given wasn't the complete story, and she had gone looking for the rest of it, quietly, carefully, alone, because she knew her father well enough to know that he was not ready to look for it alongside her. He stood and walked to the window. Below, the hospital parking lot was ordinary and still. Afternoon light lay flat across the asphalt. A family was walking toward the entrance, a man carrying a child on his shoulders, a woman beside them with a diaper bag. Jack pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he kept in his contacts under a single letter. The line rang twice. "Cutter," he said when it picked up. "It's Jack." He paused, and in that pause was everything: the controlled surface of a man who had been trained by hard experience not to let the worst moments of his life show on the outside. And beneath that surface, a father standing in a hospital room with his daughter hooked to machines, while her handwriting described months of secret searching for a woman who had been gone half of Katie's life. "Someone put Katie in the hospital," Jack said. His voice was level. The words were not. "I need you and the brothers. I need everyone you can reach. Now." There was a silence on the other end. Then Cutter said, "Where?" "Clanton General." Another silence. "How many?" "All of them," Jack said. He ended the call and stood at the window. In the parking lot below, the afternoon light was shifting toward evening, the shadows lengthening across the asphalt. In 50 minutes, the first of them would arrive. In 2 hours, there would be nearly 400. They would come because he had called, because the bond forged on long roads and in hard rooms doesn't dissolve when you hang up your cut and settle into a quiet life in a small town. It goes dormant, but it doesn't die. I walked back to this chair beside Katie's bed and sat down again and took her hand. "I'm going to find out who did this," he told her quietly. "I promise you that. But first, I'm going to sit here with you for a little while, because that matters too." The monitors kept their steady count. Outside the window, the first sound of a motorcycle engine drifted up from the street below. Then a second. Then, like thunder, beginning far off and rolling closer, a third and a fourth and more. Cutter arrived 40 minutes later, a big man with a shaved head and a silver beard and forearms like dock rope, wearing his cut with the casual authority of someone who has never once questioned whether he belonged where he was. He found Jack in the hallway outside Katie's room and crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides. "How is she?" His voice was quiet and careful in a way that didn't match his size. "Still out," Jack said. "Doctor says the next day will tell us more, but she's stable." Cutter nodded. He looked through the window at the girl in the bed, and something moved across his face that would have surprised anyone who had only ever seen him in his other context. He had known Katie since she was 5 years old. He had attended her middle school graduation because Jack had asked him to, and they both pretended afterward that it was no big deal. "Who?" Cutter asked. Jack told him. The name had come through Vera Stanton, who had called him from the alley, and who had also, in her careful and thorough way, called the hospital to give them a full account of what she had witnessed and heard. The hospital had passed the name along when Jack arrived. Vera had heard every word the man said before he walked away. She had a retired schoolteacher's gift for exact recall. "Raymond Doyle," Jack said. The hallway was quiet. Down the corridor, a cart wheeled past. Someone's family was having a conversation in low voices near the elevator. Cutter said nothing for a moment. "Then Doyle's been in the wind for years. Word was he'd gone south." "Word was wrong," Jack said. "What does he want?" Jack thought about the notebook on the bedside table. about the 31 questions, about the entry dated yesterday. He thought about Claire, a woman he had not spoken to in 14 years, a woman whose absence had shaped his daughter in ways he was only now beginning to understand. I don't know yet, Jack said, but I'm going to find out. From the elevator at the end of the hall, Sheriff Wren Adler appeared, moving at pace, her face set with the expression of someone who has just learned that their quiet Sunday has become significantly more complicated. She stopped when she saw Jack assess the situation with the efficiency of 20 years of training and came the rest of the way down the corridor with measured steps. Mr. Hale, she said, I've got a report about Katie, I'm sorry. And then without pausing, I also have a report that there are 63 motorcycles in my hospital parking lot with more arriving every few minutes. I'd like to understand what's happening before I make decisions about it. People heard about Katie, Jack said simply. They came to make sure she's protected. Adler studied him. 400 bikers isn't protection, Jack. It's a statement. Sometimes those are the same thing, Sheriff. She held his gaze for a long moment. Her expression was not unfriendly, but it was not soft either. It was the face of someone doing a calculation that involved multiple competing responsibilities, none of which were simple. I'm investigating the attack. My department is handling this. I need you to tell me that what's happening in my parking lot is not going to become a problem. I give you my word, Jack said, that my people are not here to cause trouble. And Raymond Doyle, Jack looked at her steadily. Where did you hear that name? Vera Stanton is a very thorough woman, Adler said. She gave me a complete account before the ambulance reached the hospital. Exact words, exact sequence of events. She paused. Is there something you need to tell me about Doyle that would help my investigation? Not yet, Jack said, but maybe soon. Adler considered that. She was not a woman who accepted incomplete answers easily, but she was also not a woman who failed to recognize when pushing further would cost more than it gained. Keep it together out there, she said, and turned and walked back toward the elevator. From somewhere below, filtered up through the floors of the building, through concrete and glass, in the ambient sound of a working hospital, came the sound of engines. Not one or two. Many. A low, rolling collective thunder that built steadily, that pressed against the walls of the building like weather moving in. Jack went back into Katie's room and sat in the chair beside her bed. He reached into the plastic bag and found something small at the bottom, loose, separate from everything else. The small iron clasp from Katie's bracelet. Just the clasp, not the bracelet itself, which meant someone had kept it. He turned it over in his palm. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Vera Stanton's number. I have the bracelet. It's safe. I'll bring it to you tonight. He closed his fingers around the clasp. He had pressed it closed himself on the morning of Katie's 18th birthday, sitting at the kitchen table with the finished bracelet in front of him and his daughter across from him, with her coffee and her slight impatience, and her trying not to show how much it meant. Outside, the thunder of engines continued to build. The parking lot was filling. His brothers had heard, and they had come, 400 men on thundering machines, filling the streets of a small Alabama town at the end of a Sunday afternoon, announcing in the only language available to them that something had happened to someone who mattered. Jack sat in the quiet of his daughter's room and held the small iron clasp and listened to them arrive. He did not know yet what he was going to do. He did not know what Raymond Doyle wanted, or what Claire could tell him, or what the notebook full of 31 questions meant for the version of the past he'd been living inside for 14 years. But he knew this: Katie was breathing. Her hand was warm in his, and whatever came next, he was not going to face it the way he had faced everything else, alone, sideways, and too proud to ask for help. He was going to do it right this time. He just wasn't entirely sure yet what right looked like. The monitors beeped. The engines rumbled. The evening came down over Clanton, Alabama, pressing the day's warmth into the earth and pulling the first stars out of the darkening sky. By the time Jack came back downstairs, the parking lot had found its own rhythm. His brothers had been there long enough to stop being a spectacle and start being a presence, which was, he understood, the more useful thing to be. The initial alarm of arrival had settled into something organized and purposeful. Men in leather cuts stood in clusters, talking quietly, smoking, drinking coffee from paper cups. They had arranged themselves without being asked a loose perimeter around the building teams of 2 and 3 at each entrance, a rotating watch that shifted every hour with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before. Cutter appeared at his shoulder. 399 by my count. Dobbs is coming up from Montgomery. He'll make it 400 by midnight. Jack nodded. He was watching a group near the far end of the lot, 4 men from the Decatur chapter, who had moved their bikes to free up the spaces nearest the entrance for hospital vehicles. They hadn't been asked. They'd just done it. Town's scared, Cutter said. Not a criticism, an observation. Town has reason to be, Jack said. 400 bikers showing up on a Sunday evening will do that. He went back inside. He spent the next hour at Katie's bedside. The doctor came in twice, once to check the monitors, and once to report that the internal bleeding had slowed further, which was the best news possible. Katie's color was slightly better than it had been. Her breathing had steadied. The nurse said her brain activity was normal on the scan, which meant the concussion, though severe, had not caused structural damage. Around 7 in the evening, he left the room and found Cutter in the hallway. I need to find Merle, Jack said. Cutter fell into step beside him without asking why. Merle's diner was dark and locked when they arrived. The closed sign turned in the window. Jack went around to the side door and knocked 3 times. A light came on in the back. The door opened and Merle stood there in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, a book still in his hand, his expression shifting through surprise and concern, and something that might have been guilt before settling into the careful neutrality of a man who knows a conversation is coming. Jack, he said. Merle. Jack stepped inside. Cutter stayed at the door. The kitchen smelled of the day's cooking grease and coffee, and the faint sweetness of the pie Merle always made on Sundays. The most ordinary smell in the world, and it felt wrong against the sharpness of everything Jack was carrying. How is she? Merle asked. Stable, Jack said. For now. He set his hands on the stainless prep counter and looked at the older man directly. I need you to tell me about Claire. Merle took off his reading glasses and set them on the counter. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man deciding whether to lie, but the silence of a man deciding how much of the truth to hand over. Jack recognized the difference. He'd lived in it for years. She came to me about 6 months ago, Merle said finally. Came in on a Tuesday morning before we opened. I hadn't seen her since she left. He paused. She looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from not sleeping. What did she want? She wanted to know about Katie, how she was doing, whether she was happy. Merle folded his hands on the counter. I told her Katie was fine, better than fine. I told her Katie was the best thing that had happened to this diner since I bought the place. He glanced up. Then she asked if I would help her. Help her how? Help her arrange to see Katie without causing complications. He paused. Without you knowing. And you said yes. I said yes, Merle confirmed. He didn't apologize for it, which Jack respected more than he would have respected an apology. She's that girl's mother, Jack. Whatever happened between the two of you, she's still that. And Katie had a right to know her. Did she tell you why she left? Merle hesitated. Not all of it. She said there were reasons. Said she'd been watching from a distance for years and that she'd stayed away because she thought it was safer that way. He searched for the word. She seemed like someone who had been afraid for a very long time and was only just starting to consider the possibility that they didn't have to be anymore. Jack looked at the wall above the pass-through window where Merle had tacked up photographs over the years, the diner, when it was new, his late wife at the counter, a string of Christmases and 4th of Julys that had accumulated into the evidence of a life. In the corner of the most recent cluster, barely visible, was a photo he recognized Katie in her apron, laughing at something off-camera mid-motion, the way she always was. Where is she staying? Jack asked. Merle reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a matchbook. It was from a place called the Copperhead Lounge, a bar out on Route 43, about 12 miles east of Clanton. He set it on the counter between them. She mentioned it once, Merle said. Said she liked it because it was quiet and nobody paid attention to anybody else's business. There are some cabins behind the main building. She said something about staying in one of them. Jack picked up the matchbook. Jack! Merle's voice stopped him at the door. She's not who you think she is. She's not who you've been thinking she was for 14 years. I can't tell you more than that because I don't know more than that. But I think you need to go talk to her before you decide what you already know. Jack looked at him for a moment. Then he pocketed the matchbook and walked out. The Copperhead Lounge sat back from Route 43 behind a gravel lot and a row of old pecan trees that softened it from the road. It was the kind of place that had been there since before the road was paved, a long, low building with a tin roof and a neon sign in the window, and the particular atmosphere of a bar that has never once tried to be anything other than exactly what it is. Country music came through the walls at a volume that suggested the jukebox had been set by someone already past caring. Behind the main building, a path of packed dirt led through a stand of pine trees to four small cabins each, with a single light burning on the porch. Jack parked his bike at the edge of the lot and sat for a moment. 14 years. I had built an entire interior architecture around the fact of Claire's absence, a whole system of walls and angles designed to remain functional without that particular load-bearing element. He had built it carefully and maintained it well and had come to trust it the way you trust a structure you've lived inside long enough to stop noticing it. He was about to find out what happened to it. He walked to cabin 3, the one at the end of the row, with a single lamp glowing warm behind thin curtains, and knocked. Silence, then movement inside. The light shifted. He knocked again. Claire, he said, not loud, just enough to carry through the door. It's Jack. A long pause, then the sound of a lock turning. She opened the door and they looked at each other across the threshold of 14 years. She was 42 now, a year younger than he was, and the years showed in her the way they show in people who have spent them in motion rather than in comfort. Her dark hair was shorter than he remembered, cut close around her face, with strands of silver at the temples that she hadn't bothered to conceal. The lines around her eyes were the kind that come from squinting in unfamiliar sunlight in too many different places. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, and behind her, visible in the lamplight, was an open suitcase on the floor with clothes in it. She was preparing to run. He could see it the way you see it in someone who has been running long enough that it becomes posture. You were leaving, Jack said. I was going to call the diner in the morning to make sure Katie was all right, Claire said. Her voice was careful. And then I was going to leave, he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. She held his gaze. Please come in. The cabin's interior was small and spare, a single room with a kitchenette along one wall, a bed made with the careful precision of someone who has stayed in enough temporary places to understand that small disciplines matter. The suitcase on the floor was half-packed. A paperback novel lay face down on the small table beside the lamp, a habit she'd always had that used to drive him mildly crazy. She closed the door behind him and stood with her back near it, not blocking it. Old habit. Katie's in the hospital, Jack said. I think you know that. I didn't know until an hour ago, Claire said. Someone I used to know called me, said there were 400 motorcycles outside Clanton General. Her voice remained level, but her hands, which she held clasped in front of her, were white at the knuckles. Is she? She's stable. She's going to recover. He watched something move through Claire's face at those words, a loosening, a brief and private collapse of something held rigid before she pulled it back. Someone beat her in the alley behind Merle's diner, left her there, tore her bracelet off her wrist. He paused, told her to give me a message from Raymond Doyle. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Claire closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Sit down, Jack, she said. I'd rather stand. Please, shh. Something in her voice made him move to the chair at the small table. She remained standing, her back near the door, her hands still clasped. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something he couldn't identify. Then she began. It was 2010, she said. Katie had just turned 4. You were doing long runs sometimes, gone 4 or 5 days at a stretch. I was alone with her most of the time. She kept her voice even, factual. I started noticing things. A car I didn't recognize parked on our street too many days in a row. A man outside Katie's preschool who wasn't there to pick anyone up. Small things, the kind of things you notice when you've been paying attention long enough. Jack was still. I tried to tell you, she said. You remember. He did remember, vaguely. Claire at the kitchen table, her voice tight, telling him she was worried. Him reassuring her. Him in the full confidence of a man who believed his reputation was sufficient armor for everyone around him. Telling her that Doyle was old business, and old business stayed buried. I remember, he said. You told me Doyle was all talk, Claire said. You told me the thing with his brother in Harlan County was old and settled, and that Doyle didn't have the reach or the patience to follow through on anything. I believe that. I know you did. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply honest. But one morning, about 3 weeks after that conversation, I picked Katie up from preschool, and Raymond Doyle was standing in the parking lot. Jack went very still. He didn't approach us, Claire said. He just stood there and looked at me. Then he looked at Katie, and then he looked back at me, and he smiled and he left. She paused. That evening I got a phone call. A man's voice, not Doyle, someone who worked for him. He described Katie's classroom. He described her cubby, what she kept in it, the name of the stuffed rabbit she left there because she was afraid it would get lost. He told me what Katie had for lunch that day. He told me the name of the little girl she sat beside at the craft table. The room was completely quiet except for the distant sound of the jukebox in the bar. He said Raymond Doyle wanted Jack Hale to understand what it felt like to lose something you loved more than your own life, Claire said, and that if I told you about the call, they would know, and then they would move up the timeline. Jack felt something happening in his chest that he did not have language for. So I made a decision, Claire said. She looked at him directly the way she had always been able to, and he understood that what was coming had been carried for 14 years and gone over enough times to know exactly what it was. I spent 3 weeks making it look like I was having an affair. I left evidence. I made sure people saw things. I made sure you would find what you needed to find to believe I had left on my own terms for my own reasons. Why? The word came out before he could think about it. Because if you thought I left you, she said, you'd be angry, you'd be hurt, but you would let me go because you have too much pride to chase someone who chose to leave. And if you let me go, Doyle's people would follow me. I became the target instead of Katie. Jack stood up from the chair. He turned away from her and put his hands on the edge of the kitchenette counter and looked at the wall. He needed a moment in which he was not looking at her face. 14 years of a specific, settled, carefully maintained anger. The anger of a man who has been abandoned by someone he trusted, shifting underneath him like ground in an earthquake. The architecture he had built around that anger, the whole interior structure of it, cracking along lines he hadn't known existed. You ran for 14 years, he said. His voice came out rough. Alone. I kept moving, she said. Every few months I'd find a new place. When I thought it was safe, I'd slow down. Something would happen and I'd move again. She paused. They were persistent. Doyle had money and he had time and he had people who were loyal to him, the way some people are loyal to old grievances with a patience that outlasts almost everything else. He died, Jack said. 7 years ago. He did, Claire said, but the people around him didn't, and they had their own reasons by then. Doyle had spent years telling them a version of the Harlan County story in which you were the villain. By the time he died, they believed it. It had become its own thing, separate from Doyle himself. Jack turned around. He looked at her, really looked at her, not with the filter of 14 years of anger, but as clearly as he was capable of looking at anything. Katie found you, he said. Claire's expression shifted. The pain in it was complicated and specific. 6 months ago, she sent me a letter to an address I hadn't used in 2 years. I still don't know exactly how she found it. A faint, involuntary softness moved across her face. She's extraordinary, Jack. She tracked me through a forwarding address at the Clanton post office, cross-referenced it with a P.O. box in Hartselle, found an old email address I'd used once to pay a bill online, and sent me a letter that was so calm and so careful and so completely without anger that She stopped. I should have stayed away. I knew it was dangerous to respond, but I couldn't. She's your daughter, Jack said. She's my daughter, Claire agreed, and that was all either of them said for a moment. When he walked back to the hospital 2 hours later, something had changed in the parking lot that he could see from a block away. The nature of the gathering had shifted. He rounded the corner onto the main lot and stopped. Cutter was waiting for him. Come look at something, he said. Honda led Jack around to the side of the building. 6 of his brothers were working the lot as a de facto traffic team, waving hospital vehicles through keeping the motorcycle rows tight and clear of the access lanes. Near the hospital side entrance, 2 men he recognized from the Huntsville chapter were helping an elderly couple navigate the steps, one of them carrying the man's walker, the other offering her arm to the woman. Inside the lobby, visible through the glass, 3 more were assisting a hospital orderly moving a supply cart down a corridor. Nobody asked them to, Cutter said. They just started doing it. Jack looked at the street beyond the lot. A small group of residents had gathered not with the alarm of the afternoon crowd, but with something more uncertain. Curiosity, maybe. Or the beginning of something that hadn't decided yet what it was. Jack walked back inside and up to the second floor. He was halfway down the corridor toward Katie's room when he heard something that stopped him. A laugh. It was thin and tired and brief, but it was unmistakably a laugh, and it was coming from the right room. He pushed open the door. Katie was awake. She was propped slightly up against the pillows. A nurse must have elevated the head of the bed and her eyes were open. One of them still mostly swollen shut, but the other clear and focused and unmistakably present. She turned her head when he came in, and something moved across her bruised face that he understood immediately, even through all the damage it was wearing. Relief. Dad, she said. Her voice was rough and low, like something being run carefully over gravel. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand in both of his and held it the way you hold something you were afraid you might not get to hold again. I'm here, he said. Right here. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes moved past him to the doorway, and he watched her expression change. He turned. Claire stood in the doorway. She had followed him from the cabin, he had told her where they were, and she had said she was coming, and he had not told her not to. She stood with her hand on the door frame and her eyes fixed on her daughter, and whatever composure she had maintained through their conversation in the cabin was not going to survive this particular moment. He could see that clearly. He watched her fight it and lose. Katie stared at her mother for a long time. The room was very quiet. The monitors kept their count. Outside, somewhere below, an engine turned over. Mom, Katie said. The word was barely a sound. Claire came into the room. She sat in the chair on the other side of the bed and reached for Katie's hand, the one Jack wasn't holding, and Katie let her take it. And for a while nobody said anything because nothing needed to be said yet. The 3 of them simply occupied the same room for the first time in 14 years, and that fact alone required a certain amount of time to become real. Eventually, Katie looked from one of them to the other. Her voice when it came was soft but clear. You both came. Yes, Jack said. Together. Not exactly, he said, but close enough. Katie closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the expression on her face was the one he'd been seeing since she was old enough to have opinions, the particular look of someone who has decided exactly what they want to say and has committed to saying it without apology. Stop punishing each other, she said quietly, for trying to protect me. I can't heal if you 2 keep breaking. Nobody answered that. There was nothing to answer. It was simply true, the way the things that matter most tend to be simply true without decoration. It was Cutter who interrupted them 30 minutes later, a soft knock on the open door, his large frame filling it, his expression carefully neutral. Jack, he said, something you need to see. Jack looked at Katie. Her eyes were growing heavy again. Claire was still holding her hand. I'll be right back, he told his daughter. In the corridor, Cutter led him to the window at the end of the hall that overlooked the front parking lot. He pointed to the building across the street, a three-story medical office building, closed for the evening, its windows dark. On the second floor in the corner window, something caught the light, a reflection brief and small, the kind produced by optics, a lens. How long? Jack said. Hawk spotted it about 20 minutes ago. We've been watching since. Cutter kept his voice low. There's a car in the alley beside that building, been there since at least 4 o'clock. Nobody we recognize. Jack looked at the window. The reflection was gone now, but its absence wasn't reassuring. Doyle's people were in this town before I even made the call, Jack said. That's what it looks like. Jack stood at the window and understood something that rearranged several pieces of the picture he'd been assembling. This hadn't been a warning sent in response to something he'd done. This had been planned, time, position set up in advance. The attack on Katie hadn't been opportunistic. It had been the opening move of something already in motion before he knew it existed. I was still processing this when Cutter's phone buzzed. Cutter looked at the screen, then held it out to Jack without a word. A photo, taken within the last hour from the parking lot, showing Jack's bike. Tucked under the seat, visible at the edge of the frame, was a white envelope. One of the brothers found it 10 minutes ago, Cutter said. Nobody saw who left it. It was there, and then it was there, and we had 40 men within 50 yards the entire time. Jack went downstairs. The envelope was plain white, unsealed, with nothing written on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. The message was printed in plain block letters. Black Ridge Quarry, 4 a.m., come alone. No club, no badge, or the girl doesn't go home. Jack read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood in the parking lot for a moment. Around him, his brothers continued their quiet rotations, men who had ridden hundreds of miles to stand in a hospital parking lot in a small Alabama town at the end of a difficult Sunday, because someone had asked and because the code by which they lived said you answered that kind of asking without conditions. Above him on the second floor, his daughter was awake, and his ex-wife, the woman he had hated for 14 years, for the wrong reasons, was sitting beside her holding her hand. And somewhere in this town, Doyle's people were watching all of it through a lens in a dark window, counting on Jack Hale to do what Jack Hale had always done: move fast, move hard, move alone, and trust that force was sufficient answer to any question. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and touched the folded paper. They knew him. They knew how he worked and what he reached for under pressure and what story he told himself about strength, which meant the only real advantage he had was the possibility of being someone they didn't expect. He went back inside to find Cutter. The hospital cafeteria was empty at 1 in the morning, except for the hum of the drink machines and the flat buzz of the overhead lights, and the 4 people sitting around 2 tables pushed together near the back wall. Outside the windows, the parking lot was a field of dark shapes and glowing cigarette ends. His brothers still there, still turning their quiet rotations in the Alabama night. Jack had asked for this meeting. He had chosen the cafeteria because it was neutral ground, and because the whiteboard on the wall near the serving station would be useful, and because the coffee machine still worked at this hour, which mattered more than he would have admitted. He poured 4 cups and set them on the table without asking who wanted one. Everyone took one. Sheriff Wren Adler sat across from him in plain clothes. Dark jacket, no badge visible, though he understood it was there. She had come without being asked twice, which told him something about how she was reading the situation. Beside her, Cutter sat with his forearms on the table and his hands wrapped around his cup, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man conserving energy for what comes later. And across from Cutter in the chair closest to the wall sat Claire. Adler had not reacted when Claire came into the room. She had simply looked at her with the measuring attention of someone cataloging new information, and then she had sat down. That restraint, Jack thought, was either professional discipline or a quality of character. He suspected it was both. What I'm about to tell you, Jack said, stays in this room until we decide otherwise. He looked at Adler. That includes your department for now. That depends on what it is, Adler said. Fair enough. He set his cup down. Doyle's people have been in Clanton for at least 48 hours before I made any calls. The attack on Katie wasn't a reaction to anything I did. It was the opening move of a plan already in motion. He paused. They left that envelope on my bike inside a perimeter of 40 of my brothers without being seen. That tells you the level of operation we're dealing with. Adler was quiet for a moment. How many? At least 6, Claire said. All 3 of them looked at her. She held the attention without flinching. They typically work in cells of 3. Doyle's operation used 2 cells for anything that required a message to be delivered. There'll be a 3rd cell on observation. She paused. So probably 8 to 12 total with Doyle's successor running point. Doyle's successor, Adler said. Who is that? A man named Garrett Vance, Claire said. He was Doyle's logistics man for the last decade. Quiet, patient, more organized than Doyle ever was. She looked at her hands. He's the reason I kept moving after Doyle died. Doyle was personal. Vance is professional. He doesn't hate Jack. He just has a ledger that isn't balanced. Jack looked at her. You knew about Vance. I've known about Vance for 7 years, she said. I didn't know he'd move on, Katie. I thought he was still waiting. I thought he was building something and that he'd come after you directly when he was ready. Not her. Why did he come after her? Cutter asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. Because she started asking questions that led to me. And I led to the whole thing. She looked at Jack. When Katie found me, I should have ended it immediately. I should have sent her away and moved again. But I couldn't. And every meeting we had, every public place we sat together and talked, was a thread that someone careful could follow back. The cafeteria was very quiet. Jack looked at the whiteboard on the wall and thought about what he needed to say next. The note says Black Ridge Quarry at 4 in the morning, he said. Come alone. No club, no badges. He looked around the table. They're expecting me to either comply or to come in hard with everyone I've got. Those are the 2 versions of Jack Hale they've prepared for. So you do neither, Adler said. I go in as they expect, Jack said. Alone, on my bike, visibly alone. He stood and moved to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and drew a rough circle, the quarry which he knew from years of riding those roads. Then he began marking positions around it. But I won't be alone, not really. Hun outlined it carefully, the way he'd been building it in his head for the last 2 hours. He drew the access road, a single lane that wound down through rock, cut to the open floor of the pit, with high walls on 3 sides and dense pine forest running along the ridge on the 4th. He marked the tree line. He marked the 2 high points on the eastern wall where anyone setting up observation would position themselves. My people go in on foot starting at 2, he said. Not on bikes, on foot through the forest on the north ridge. Teams of 4 dark clothing, no lights. They move into position and they stay there until the signal. He looked at Cutter. Hawk leads the north team. Dobbs takes the east approach. Cutter nodded once. The quarry has 1 road in and 1 road out, Jack continued. I go down the road at 4. Whatever happens inside, nothing comes out that road that isn't expected. He marked 2 points on the access road. I need vehicles here and here. Not marked, not running, just there. Adler leaned forward and looked at the drawing. I can put 2 plain units on the ridge road without them being visible from the quarry floor. And I can have tactical standing by on Highway 9 12 minutes out. She paused. 12 minutes is a long time. It is, Jack agreed, which is why my people are closer. My department takes custody of anyone we detain, Adler said. That's not a negotiation. Wouldn't have it any other way, Jack said. Adler looked at him steadily. He returned the look with equal steadiness, and they arrived silently at something that was not quite trust, but was close enough to function as trust, which was all that was needed. Claire had been looking at the whiteboard. Vance will have the high ground on the east wall, she said. He'll want to see everything before it moves. He's a watcher. She stood and took the marker from Jack without asking and marked a specific point on the eastern ridge. There, that's where he'll be. Not on the quarry floor with the others. He'll have 2 men with him, and he'll have a clear line to whoever runs the floor operation. How certain are you? Adler asked. Certain enough, Claire said. She set the marker down. I've had 14 years to think about how these people operate. Adler looked at the mark on the board. Then she made a note on a small pad she kept in her jacket pocket. They worked for another 40 minutes going over contingencies and timing and the specific language of the signal. Jack would activate his bike's high beam twice a half second between them when he needed the perimeter to close. Not 3 times, not once, twice. Cutter would be on a ridge with a direct sight line to the quarry floor and would relay to the teams. When they were done, Adler stood and put on her jacket. She looked at Jack across the table with the expression of someone who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with and has made it anyway because it is the right one. I've arrested a lot of men in leather cuts over the years, she said. I want to be transparent about that. I've arrested men from your former club specifically for things that warranted it. She held his gaze. But I've also been a cop long enough to know that doing the right thing sometimes requires doing it with people you didn't expect to be standing next to. She picked up her hat. Don't make me regret this. I won't, Jack said. She left. Cutter followed her out to coordinate with the brother handling team assignments, which left Jack and Claire alone in the cafeteria at 20 minutes to 2 in the morning. Claire sat back down and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, which was long cold. She looked at the whiteboard with Jack's rough drawings still on it, the quarry, the positions, the access road, the marks she'd added from 14 years of careful attention to the shape of a threat she'd been living inside. You should go be with Katie, she said. I will, he said. In a minute. He sat back down across from her. The cafeteria felt very large and very quiet around them. Outside the windows, one of his brothers was walking a slow circuit of the far edge of the parking lot, hands in his jacket pockets, breath visible in the cool air. After tonight, Jack said. He stopped, started again. After tonight, when this is over, what do you want? Claire looked at him. The question seemed to catch her somewhere she hadn't fully prepared for. For what do you mean, Beth? I mean what I asked, he said. What do you want? Not what you think you deserve, not what you think is possible. What do you want? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the brother finished his circuit and started another. I want to stop moving, she said finally. Her voice was careful, like someone putting weight on a floor they're not sure will hold. I want to know where I'm going to be in 6 months. I want to be able to call Katie without wondering if the call is being traced. She paused. I want to be somewhere she can find me if she needs to. Somewhere that doesn't change every few months. And, he said, she looked at him steadily, and I want to stop being angry at you for not believing me 14 years ago. And I want you to stop being angry at me for doing what I thought was the only thing I could do. Because we were both trying to protect the same person, and we both got it wrong in different ways, and carrying that is... She stopped. It's very heavy, she said simply. It's been very heavy for a long time. Jack was quiet. He looked at the table. He thought about the notebook, the 31 questions written in Katie's careful hand. He thought about 14 years of his daughter growing up without her mother, because 2 people had been unable to find a way to the same truth from different directions. Yeah, he said, it has. I went upstairs. He sat with Katie for an hour, talking softly to her in the way you talk to someone drifting between sleep and waking. Not expecting response, just providing the sound of a familiar voice as a kind of anchor. He told her about the quarry. He told her what he was going to do and roughly how he planned to do it. He told her this not because she needed to know it, but because he was done making decisions in the dark, away from the people those decisions affected. She was more awake than she appeared. He realized this when she spoke without opening her eyes in that low and careful voice that was still finding its strength. You're going in alone, she said. Visibly alone, he said. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, he said. I'll have 400 men in the trees. A pause. That's not what I mean. He looked at her. One eye still swollen shut, the other open just enough to find his face. You're carrying it alone, she said. In here. She lifted the hand that wasn't in a cast and pressed two fingers briefly against her own sternum. You always have. Even when people are standing right next to you, you're carrying it alone. He didn't answer that. I know why you do it, she said. Her voice was growing slower, the current of sleep pulling at it. You think if you share the weight and something goes wrong, then the people who helped you carry it get hurt too. You think keeping it to yourself protects them. Doesn't it? He said. No, she said simply. It just means they can't help you. And then you get hurt, and they get hurt anyway, just later, and without having had the chance to do anything about it. Her eye drifted closed. Go be smarter than you usually are. He sat with her for another 20 minutes. Then he pressed a kiss to her forehead, careful of the bandaging, and stood. I'll be back before you wake up, he said. She didn't respond. She was asleep. He found Cutter in the hallway, and they went over the timing one final time. Teams were already moving toward the quarry, had been moving for the last 40 minutes, fanning out through the pine forest on the north ridge in the dark and the cold. No lights, no engines, boots on pine needles and rock, the way it had been done in older times when the stakes required silence. At 3:30, Jack rode out of the hospital parking lot alone. I took the long route, not the most direct road, but the one that ran through the open countryside east of Clanton, where the land flattened out into old cotton fields and scrub pine, and the sky came down wide and dark and full of stars, very clear at this hour, with no one around to produce light that competed with them. He rode at a steady pace, not fast, letting the night settle around him. He thought about Harlan County. It was a thing he had not thought about directly in a long time, not because he had forgotten it, but because he had become skilled at thinking around it the way you learn to move around a piece of furniture in the dark without having to look at it. He knew exactly where it was. He simply never looked at it straight. Tommy Doyle had been 26 years old, a younger brother who had come up through the Devil's Iron and who had, by the spring of 2005, become a problem of a specific kind. The kind that exists at the intersection of loyalty and liability, where the same qualities that made a man useful in one context make him dangerous in another. Tommy talked too much and drank too much and had begun in the months before Harlan County to say things in the wrong rooms to the wrong people. Jack had known. He had known, and he had made a call not to hurt Tommy, not deliberately, but to put him in a position where the situation could resolve itself. He had known when he made that call that the position was dangerous. He had told himself that Tommy understood the game and that understanding the game meant accepting its consequences. Tommy had not come back from Harlan County. Jack had told himself for 19 years that it was an accident, that the chain of events had been beyond his control once it started, that he had not intended what happened. All of those things were partially true. They were true in the way that incomplete sentences are true, technically accurate in what they say, and profoundly dishonest in what they leave out. He turned onto the quarry road at 3:55. The access road was unmarked, a break in the fence line along Route 43 that most people drove past without registering, leading to a single lane of packed gravel that wound down through a cut in the limestone for a quarter mile before opening into the quarry floor. He took the descent slowly. His headlights swept the limestone walls on either side, throwing long shadows that moved like something living across the pale rock. At the bottom, the road flattened and the walls fell away, and the quarry floor opened up a wide, roughly circular expanse of pale gravel and rock, maybe 200 yards across, surrounded on three sides by the high limestone walls, and on the fourth by the pine forest climbing the north ridge. He cut his engine at the center of the floor. The silence was immediate and complete. He could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the limestone around him ticking as it gave up the day's stored heat into the cold air. Above the rim of the quarry walls, the sky was beginning to consider the possibility of dawn. Not light yet, just a slight lessening of the dark at the eastern edge, the world doing its arithmetic. He sat on the bike and waited. They came from the south, from behind a stack of rusted equipment that had been sitting at the base of the far wall since before the quarry closed. Three men first, then two more emerging from behind a low concrete structure to his left. Then two from the right, and then from the shadows between the equipment and the wall. a single figure moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has never once been in a hurry, because he has always believed that patience was the most powerful weapon available. Garrett Vance was 63 years old and looked less like a dangerous man than most dangerous men Jack had encountered. He was medium height, slightly built with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of unremarkable face that would not stay in your memory 5 minutes after you'd seen it. He wore a plain dark coat and carried nothing visible. His hands were at his sides, and his pace was unhurried, and he moved through the dark of the quarry floor as though he owned it, which in the operational sense of the word he currently did. He stopped 20 feet from Jack. "You came alone," Vance said. His voice was mild. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being underestimated, and therefore accustomed to winning. "You said to," Jack replied. "Most men in your position would have cheated." "Maybe I'm not most men," Jack said. Vance studied him for a moment, with the measuring attention of someone making a final assessment of something they've been studying from a distance for a long time. "You look older than I expected," he said. 19 years will do that." "Yes," Vance agreed. "They will." He tilted his head slightly. "You know what I want." "You want what Raymond wanted," Jack said. "You want me to account for Tommy Doyle." "I want you to say it," Vance said. "That's all. Not in a courtroom, not in a statement, just here in this place, out loud between us. I want to hear Jack Hale say what he did and what he knew when he did it." He paused. "Raymond spent 19 years wanting you to suffer for it. I'm not interested in suffering. I'm interested in the truth. That's all I've ever been interested in." Jack looked at him. He looked at the men around him, 7 that he could see positioned with the practiced geometry of people who had done this before. He thought about Claire, who had spent 14 years running from this moment. He thought about Katie lying in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and a fractured wrist, and the particular kind of damage that comes from being used as a message. He thought about what his daughter had said to him 2 hours ago. "Go be smarter than you usually are." And then he thought about what she had said before, that the first time she had found her voice after waking up looking at him from the bed with one eye swollen shut and the other clear and steady and entirely her own. "Stop punishing each other for trying to protect me." He straightened on the bike. He put both feet on the ground, and he looked at Garrett Vance across 20 feet of pale quarry gravel, and he said what he had spent 19 years finding reasons not to say. "Tommy Doyle didn't have to die," he said. His voice was level and clear and carried in the silence of the quarry without effort. "I made a call in the spring of 2005 that put him in a position I knew was dangerous. I told myself I didn't know how dangerous, but I knew. I knew, and I made the call anyway because Tommy had become a problem, and I was more concerned with protecting myself and the club than I was with protecting him." He paused. He let the words stand in the air of the quarry, which was cold and still, and absorbed them without judgment. "That is what happened. I've known it was what happened for 19 years. I'm telling you now because it's true and because it should have been said a long time ago." The quarry was completely silent. Vance stood very still. Something was happening in his face, a subtle structural thing, like watching a building register an impact. Not collapse, not break, but register. The 19 years of maintenance that had kept a certain posture intact, shifting in response to something it hadn't fully been built to accommodate. He had expected Jack to deflect, to negotiate, to offer something that stopped short of what he'd asked for. He had prepared for those responses. He had not, in the operational planning of this moment, fully prepared for the one that arrived. He stood with it for a long moment. Then his hand moved not toward a weapon, but downward. A release, a lowering of something he'd been holding for a very long time. "That's all I wanted," Vance said. His voice was quieter than it had been. Something had gone out of it, not weakness, but a tension that had been the structural element of everything else, and without which everything else became simply a collection of pieces rather than a threat. He took one step back. Jack reached down to his handlebars and activated the high beam twice a half second between them, and the quarry exploded into light. From the north ridge, the east wall, and the access road lights blazed simultaneously, the concentrated beams of tactical flashlights, and vehicle headlights converging on the quarry floor from every direction. From the tree-lined figures emerged in steady movement, his brothers in dark clothing coming out of the pines, the way a tide comes in, unhurried and inevitable. From the access road, two vehicles moved slowly down toward the floor, their headlights sweeping the walls. And from the eastern ridge, the exact point Claire had marked on the whiteboard in the hospital cafeteria, the sound of calm, official voices carrying down across the limestone in the pre-dawn air. Vance's men did not reach for weapons. They were professionals, and professionals understood the arithmetic of the moment as quickly as it presented itself. They stood with their hands visible and their options clearly enumerated, and they made the only calculation that produced a workable outcome. Adler's people moved in from three directions with the efficiency of preparation. Vance himself stood where he had been standing, looking at Jack across the gravel, and for a moment before the officers reached him, he said one more thing. Doyle spent his whole life waiting for you to break, he said. That's what he wanted, to see you broken. He looked at Jack steadily. I think he was wrong about what breaking looks like. Then the officers were beside him, and the moment closed around its own edges, and the quarry filled with the organized procedural sounds of the thing being finished. The sun came up over Clanton, Alabama, with the particular confidence of a May morning that has decided it is going to be worth the trouble. It came up orange and broad above the eastern tree line, pushing long shadows across the main street and warming the brick faces of the buildings, and finding in the parking lot of Clanton General an unusual collection of motorcycles that caught the light along their chrome and held it. The lot was quieter than it had been for 3 days. Many of the bikes were already gone, had gone in the small hours as the word came in from Black Ridge Quarry, and men who had ridden hundreds of miles to stand a watch determined that the watch was over and began the long roads home. But a significant number remained, and the men beside them moved through the morning with the particular ease of people who have done what they came to do and are in no hurry about the rest of it. Jack returned to the hospital at 6:15. He parked his bike, sat on it for a moment in the morning sun with his hands on his knees, and let himself feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for the last several hours. Not relief quite, not peace. Something more provisional than either of those, more like the first full breath after a long time of breathing carefully. He went inside. Cutter was in the lobby drinking coffee from a machine cup and talking quietly with a young nurse who was laughing at something he'd said. Cutter looked up when Jack came through the door. It's done, Jack said. Cutter nodded, no elaboration required. How'd it go? The way it needed to, Jack said. He went upstairs. In the hallway outside Katie's room, Dobbs and a man called Whitfield were on watch, two of as steady as cycling through the rotation for 3 days without complaint. They straightened when they saw him. Go get some sleep, he told them. Both of you. You've earned it. Whitfield started to say something about finishing the shift. Jack shook his head. Go. They went. He pushed open the door to Katie's room and stopped. Katie was awake, more awake than she had been since the first time she'd opened her eyes, sitting up against the elevated head of the bed. Her color significantly better. The swelling around her eye reduced enough that she could open it more than halfway. She had a cup of something from the nurse's station on her tray and was holding it in her good hand with the careful attention of someone for whom the act of holding a cup without help has recently become meaningful. Claire was in the chair beside her. She had been there since before Jack left for the quarry, and she was still there, which meant she had kept a vigil of her own through the hours he'd been gone. They both looked up when he came in. It's over, he said. Katie looked at him for a long moment, with those eyes that had always been able to find things in his face that he hadn't deliberately put there. Then she looked at Claire, and Claire looked at Jack, and something passed between all three of them that didn't require language. Vance, Claire asked. In custody, Jack said. Adler's department, all of them. Claire nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it. Not the controlled, careful face of a woman who had spent 14 years making herself difficult to read, but something older and more fundamental. Something he recognized from before. It's really over, she said. Not a question. A statement she was trying out, testing its weight. It's really over, he confirmed. She closed her eyes for a moment. Jack crossed the room and sat in the chair on the other side of Katie's bed. He reached for his daughter's hand, the one in the cast, carefully, just his fingers resting over hers. She turned her hand over and held his fingers back with the ones that weren't bandaged. I told him, Jack said. He was looking at Katie as he said it, but it was for both of them. Vance, I told him what happened in Harlan County, the real version. Katie was quiet for a moment. Was that hard? Yes, he said. Was it right? Yes, he said again. She nodded slowly. Something settled in her face, not surprise because she had told him to go be smarter than he usually was, and she had always understood him well enough to believe he occasionally could be, but something like the satisfaction of a structure, confirming that it's holding the weight it was designed to hold. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to actually answer it instead of being Jack Hale about it. I'll try, he said. What happens now, the three of us? What happens? He looked at her. He looked at Claire, who was watching him from the other side of the bed, with an expression that had questions in it, but was not pressing them, simply present and waiting and not running. He thought about what he wanted to say. He thought about the easy versions of it and the complicated versions, and the version that was simply true without being either easy or complicated. I don't know exactly, he said. I know I'm not going anywhere. I know your mother isn't going anywhere, not if she doesn't want to. I know that whatever the shape of things turns out to be, it's going to be built on what's actually true instead of what we've been carrying around because we didn't know what else to do with it. He paused. Beyond that, we figure it out as we go, together or something close enough to together that it functions. Katie looked at Claire. Claire held her gaze. Together, Claire said quietly, or something close enough. Katie looked at both of them. Then she looked down at the cup on her tray, and a very small and very tired smile found its way onto her bruised face. That's the most either of you have ever committed to anything that wasn't a motorcycle or a grudge, she said. Jack made a sound that surprised him, a short, involuntary exhale that was the closest thing to a laugh that the last 72 hours had left him capable of producing. Claire put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and her shoulders moved slightly. It was not a perfect moment. It was not the restored wholeness of something that had never been broken. It was three people in a hospital room at 6:30 in the morning, exhausted and damaged in various ways, holding what they had left and beginning to understand that what they had left might be enough to build something from. Outside in the parking lot, the morning was doing what mornings do in Alabama, in May coming in warm and bright and indifferent to the weight of the hours that preceded it, offering the day on its own terms, without any comment on what had come before. Jack heard engines, not the thunder of arrival, just the steady individual sounds of departure bikes, moving out of the lot one or two at a time, rolling down Caldwell Street toward the highway and the long roads home. He listened to them go. Cutter appeared in the doorway at 7 o'clock with his jacket over his arm and his keys in his hand. He looked at the three of them, and something in his expression acknowledged everything without requiring any of it to be said. I'm going to head out, he said. Hawk's staying until tomorrow. Dobbs and Whitfield too, if you want them. Tell them I said thank you, Jack said. Tell all of them. Cutter looked at Katie. How are you doing, kid? Better, she said. Hurts less than yesterday. That's the direction you want, he said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he always wore around her. The one that acknowledged she had grown from the 5-year-old he'd known into someone substantial and specific, without quite reconciling itself to when that had happened. You take care of yourself. You too, Cutter. He looked at Jack one more time, one of those looks refined by years into something that can carry a great deal with very little surface area. Acknowledgement, respect the particular warmth of men who have stood in hard places together and understand what that means. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, and Jack heard his boots on the stairs, and then the distant rumble of his engine starting in the lot below, and then the sound of it pulling away. By 9 o'clock, the doctor had been in and out twice with good reports. The internal bleeding had resolved. The concussion was tracking well. The ribs would take weeks, the wrist longer, but the trajectory was clearly forward. She said with the cautious optimism of someone who does not make promises she can't keep that Katie could likely go home within 2 days if things continued as they were going. Home. Jack turned the word over. His house at the edge of town, which had been built for more people than it currently held, and which he had maintained in a state of careful functionality without ever quite making it into the thing the word implied. It would need to be reconsidered. Everything was going to need to be reconsidered slowly and honestly, and in the light of what was actually true rather than what had been assumed. I was ready for that work. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it. He stepped out of the room to get coffee from the machine at the end of the hall, and on his way back he passed the window that overlooked the front of the building. He stopped. The parking lot was nearly empty of motorcycles now, just a dozen or so remaining, the last of the slow departure. On the sidewalk across the street, he could see a small group of Clanton residents standing in front of the hardware store. Men he recognized, longtime locals, people who had watched 400 bikers arrive at their town 3 days ago, with the particular alarm of a community that had never expected to be on that kind of receiving end. One of them a man named Hargrove, who owned the building supply on the corner, and who had, as long as Jack had lived in Clanton, managed to look through him rather than at him when they encountered each other in public, was crossing the street, carrying something, a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks down. Jack watched him cross the lot and approach 2 of the remaining bikers near their bikes. He held out the bag. One of the bikers took it, looked inside, looked up at Hargrove, and said something. Hargrove said something back. All 3 of them stood there for a moment in the morning sun, and then one of the bikers extended his hand and Hargrove shook it. Jack stood at the window and watched this. I was still watching when Sheriff Adler came down the corridor behind him. She stopped beside him at the window. "Vance is in processing," she said. "All 8 of them. The DA's office is going to have a busy week." "Good," Jack said. "I'll need a statement from you," she said. "Full one, about Harlan County, about your history with Doyle and Vance." She paused. "It'll open things up. Old things." "I know," he said. "You're prepared for that." "Yes," he said, and he was. He had been the man who carried things alone for so long that he had come to confuse the carrying with the strength, as though the willingness to bear weight without help was itself a virtue, rather than simply a habit. His daughter had seen through that more clearly than he had. His daughter, from a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs, had understood the thing he had spent 45 years not quite understanding. "One more thing," Adler said. "Vera Stanton came by early this morning before you got back. She sat with Katie for a little while. Said she'd been worried about the girls since Sunday and wanted to see for herself that she was all right." She paused. "Seemed to do them both some good." Jack nodded, thinking of the old woman who had descended arthritic stairs faster than she should have been able to move, who had knelt on cold concrete to brush hair from his daughter's face, who had called him herself because she thought he deserved to hear it from a person rather than a machine. Adler looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. At Hargrove, still standing with the 2 bikers, the conversation apparently continuing. She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of something she decided not to say, and then she put her hat on. "Hale," she said. He looked at her. "You did right," she said. It was 4 words, and she said them in the tone of someone who does not say things they don't mean, which gave them a weight that 4 words don't always carry. She walked down the corridor and took the stairs, and he listened to her footsteps diminish and stop, and then he turned back to the window. The morning was fully established, now the light flat and warm, the shadows pulled back under the buildings, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday in Clanton, Alabama, beginning to turn. A delivery truck was making its rounds. A woman was walking a dog on the far sidewalk. Children were somewhere, invisible but audible, their voices carrying on the warm air from the direction of the park 2 streets over. He looked at the parking lot one more time. Hargrove had gone. The 2 bikers were mounting their bikes, the paper bag from the bakery sitting on the seat of one of them. They pulled out of the lot in tandem, rolled to the street, and turned toward the highway. He went back to his daughter's room. Katie was telling Claire something, an animated account of something that had happened at the diner a few months ago. Her good hand moving as she talked, her face carrying an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she was in the middle of a story she liked. Claire was listening with the particular attention of someone who understands that what they are receiving is irreplaceable. Not just the story, but the storyteller, the specific voice and cadence, and the way her hands moved when she was excited about something. Jack stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. He looked at his daughter who had found her mother because she refused to accept that some questions didn't deserve answers. Who had been beaten in an alley and had woken up from it, clear-eyed and purposeful, and already thinking about what came next? Who had, from a hospital bed, told her father things about himself that he had needed to hear for years and had delivered them with a precision and a gentleness that left him no defense. He looked at Claire, who had made an impossible decision out of love and had carried it alone for 14 years in the particular and uncelebrated way that people carry things when they believe that carrying is the only way to protect the people they're carrying them for. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the bracelet. He had given the clasp to Cutter before he left for the quarry, and Cutter had found the leather braid from where Vera had indicated she'd placed it with the nursing station, and he had cleaned them both carefully and refastened them and pressed the finished bracelet back into Jack's hand when he came downstairs this morning. Without comment, without ceremony, just the thing done the way Cutter did things. Jack crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Katie stopped mid-sentence and looked at his hands. She recognized it immediately, not just the object, but what it meant that it was here and intact and whole. I took her left hand, the one without the cast, and held it gently, and he worked the leather braid around her wrist and pressed the small iron clasp closed with his thumb, the same way he had done it on the morning of her 18th birthday, at the kitchen table with her coffee across from him, and her trying not to let him see how much it meant. He pressed the clasp closed and held it there for a moment. He held her hand afterward, both of his wrapped around hers, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already there in the gesture and in the room and in the morning light coming through the window. Katie looked at the bracelet, then she looked up at him. "So what happens now?" she asked. He looked at her. He looked at Claire, who was watching him from the chair with an expression that was open in a way he hadn't seen it be. Not guarded, not managed, just present and waiting, and genuinely uncertain about the answer, in the way that uncertainty is sometimes the most honest thing available. I thought about the house at the edge of town. He thought about Adler's statement waiting to be given, and the old things it would open up, in the process of standing in the light of what was actually true. He thought about Hargrove crossing the parking lot with a paper bag from the bakery, and Vera Stanton kneeling on cold concrete in an alley, and 400 men who had come when he called, and had turned without being asked towards something better than what he'd called them for. I thought about his daughter's 31 questions, and the fact that she had gone looking for the answers, because she understood at some clear and practical level that the incomplete version of the story was costing all three of them something they couldn't afford to keep paying. I thought about Tommy Doyle in Harlan County, and the words he had said in the quarry in the cold pre-dawn air, and the specific quality of the silence that had followed them. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a space in which something like it might eventually be possible. "We stop running," he said. "All three of us." He said it simply and without qualification. The way you say the things that are most true, not as a promise of easy or as a guarantee of whole, but as a statement of direction. A choice made in the morning light of a hospital room in Clanton, Alabama, by a man who had spent his whole life believing that strength meant going forward alone, and who had learned in the space of 3 days that the thing he had been calling strength was just a longer way of being afraid. After a while, without planning to, he reached across the bed with his free hand. Not toward Katie, toward Claire. She looked at his hand for a moment, just a moment enough to understand what it was and what it wasn't and what it might become. Then she took it. The three of them sat like that in the morning quiet, not talking, not needing to just present, just hear, which was the only thing any of them had ever really wanted. Outside the window, the last of the motorcycles pulled out of the lot and turned toward the highway and was gone. The sound of the engine diminished and faded and became the ordinary sounds of the morning bird's traffic. A lawnmower starting somewhere on a nearby street. The world going about its business in the uncomplicated way of a day that has decided to be nothing more than itself. The room was quiet. His daughter's hand was warm in his.